Hello. Over these past few weeks, as we've been going through this period of isolation, I've been thinking quite a lot about those Christian men and women who deliberately sought out lives of solitude, the Anchorites and Anchoresses. And so for this week's comfortable words, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the history of the Anchorites, in the hopes that learning about them may make us feel a little bit less alone in our solitude. The story of the Anchorites begins, like so many of our stories do, in the deserts of Syria and Egypt. By the 3rd century, we know that quite a few people were leaving the towns and the cities and seeking the solitude of the desert for prayer. Some were doing so in the context of communities of like-minded people, but others were going it completely alone. And we hear of examples that sound outlandish, like the Stylites, people who would spend their lives living on the tops of tall pillars, engaged in extreme fasting and dispensing spiritual wisdom to the people who came by to marvel at them. But not all of the quests for solitude were quite so spectacular. For the most part, the people who fled to the desert to pray took up residence in huts or in caves, or sometimes in abandoned tombs. One such example is a man named Saint Anthony of Egypt. We know quite a lot about the life of Saint Anthony because one of his contemporaries, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote a biography of Anthony that we can still read today. St. Anthony was born around the middle of the 3rd century to rich parents, who died when he was 20 years old and left him a rich man. St. Anthony, one day in church, heard the words of our Lord recorded in the Gospel of St. Matthew, "If you want to be perfect, sell all that you have and give the money to the poor, and then you shall have riches in heaven." And so this is precisely what Anthony did. He sold his family's wealth, gave the money to the poor, and he began seeking a life of devotion. He sought advice from the hermits living in huts just outside of the towns. And then, right around the year 270, he himself took up residence in an abandoned tomb. He spent the next 15 years of his life in this tomb in relative isolation. He did accept visitors. Pilgrims came to him, and they were people who brought him food. But he was, for the most part, alone, devoting his time to prayer. One of the things Athanasius tells us is that during this period in the tomb, St. Anthony was plagued by demonic visions. He was attacked by the devil in the form of apparitions of wild beasts. St. Athanasius writes, "The demons, as if breaking the 4 walls of the dwelling, seemed to enter through them, coming in the likeness of beasts and creeping things. And the place was on a sudden filled with the forms of lions, bears, leopards, bulls, serpents, asps, scorpions, and wolves. Each of them was moving according to his nature." But what St. Anthony discovered as he prayed for protection from these visions was that the apparitions of wild beasts could threaten him. They could move like bears and scorpions, but they couldn't actually attack him because he was protected. In the end, Anthony prevails against these apparitions because he knows, as he says, that faith in our Lord is a seal and a wall of safety to us. After 15 years of living in this tomb, St. Anthony decides to go seek out an even greater solitude. And so he leaves the tombs and he takes up residence in an old fort where he can be completely walled in. At this point, he stops receiving any sort of visitor, and he even has food thrown over the wall to him so he doesn't interact even with the person bringing him supplies. St. Anthony, we're told, spends the next 20 years of his life in this fort, while meanwhile, pilgrims continue to come, only he refuses to see them. Eventually, a community of would-be disciples has grown up around the outside of this fort. and they beg him to come out and teach them. So at the age of 55, St. Anthony exits the fort and begins teaching these disciples who come. St. Athanasius records for us a sermon that he preaches to these followers upon exiting the fort. In it, he encourages these people who want, like him, to take up a life of solitude. He encourages them to compare the fleeting pleasures of the world with the eternal glory of heaven. And he urges them to take up the task as though beginning anew each day. He goes on to warn them at length about these attacks of the devil and to encourage them for when they encounter these attacks themselves. He says, "Let us not be sorrowful as though we were perishing, but rather let us be courageous and rejoice always, believing that we are safe. Let us consider in our soul that the Lord is with us, who put the evil spirits to flight and broke their power. Let us consider and lay to heart that while the Lord is with us, our foes can do us no hurt." So Anthony, we're told, spent 5 or 6 years teaching these people who'd come to him, and then retreated again into the desert to live out the rest of his life in complete solitude. And when he died, Athanasius tells us, his body was buried secretly by 2 disciples so that he couldn't become an object of veneration. Now, there are elements of St. Anthony's story, specifically this idea of a holy person going out to be alone, but being followed and having a community sort of grow up about him. Despite his intentions to the contrary, we hear about these elements in other stories as well. There's an example of this from the Middle Ages in Bruno of Cologne, who went out to become a hermit with no intention whatsoever of founding a religious order, but ended up founding the Carthusian order, which is an order of people who live together, but is based around solitude. These enclosed orders like this are the kind that we usually see depicted in movies and television shows that have monks or nuns sitting alone in their cell and only coming together periodically for worship. But the Middle Ages also saw a continuity in the practice of becoming anchorites, of seeking out solitude. There were hermits who left the cities and sought the solitude of the wilderness, but there were also, in the Middle Ages, the people who continue to be called Anchorites and Anchoresses, who would live in the city, but separated from other people. And we know quite a bit about the life of Anchoresses specifically, because there were actually written guides about how to be an Anchoress. It was a popular enough practice that we hear of approximately 100 Anchorites and Anchoresses living in England in the 12th century, and 200 between the 13th and 15th centuries. And these guides describe what happens when somebody elects to become an Anchoress. In order to give their lives over completely to prayer, they opt to be walled in completely into a small room, usually no more than 12 by 12 feet, and usually attached to the side of a church. Now, upon being sealed up in this room, the Anchoress would often receive the last rites from a priest as a sign that at this point, she's become dead to the world. And so she would be enclosed in this room, and typically the room would have 3 windows. There would be one room that opened onto a parlor where a servant could bring her food and the other necessities of life. Another window, called a squint, would open into the church itself so that she could worship and receive communion while in her cell. And the third window would open out onto the street. Interestingly, these Anchoresses were often important members of the communities where they lived. This seems counterintuitive because you wouldn't think that conversation is a big part of a life of solitude. But they were viewed by the communities as being like a spiritual anchor. People would come to them to seek spiritual advice, although they were expected to limit the amount of contact with the outside world so that they could do the work of prayer and study. But one of these guides that I mentioned describes these women as anchors. Now, the word anchoress doesn't actually come from the word anchor. It comes from a Greek word that means to withdraw. But the author of this guide makes the comparison nevertheless and takes up this imagery of the church as a ship and the anchoress as an anchor. It writes, "The anchoress is called an anchor and anchored under the church like an anchor under the side of a ship to hold it, so that waves and storms do not capsize it. Just so, all holy church, which is described as a ship, should anchor on the anchoress, for her to hold it so that the devil's blasts, which are temptations, do not blow it over." And so the anchoress was an important member of the community, not only because she was able to dispense advice to people who had come to her, but for spiritual reasons as well. She was viewed as somebody who was doing this work of prayer and resisting temptation. Because the people who went out to seek solitude, either in the deserts or in their cells, did so not to avoid the anxieties and the temptations of the world. It was so that they could face them head on. There's a recognition that these temptations don't actually come from other people. If anything, being around other people can be a hindrance to doing the work of confronting them because you have people to blame them on and you have the distractions of daily life. Instead, those Anchorites and Anchoresses went out to do spiritual battle with the fears and the misunderstood desires of their own soul, and to grow in their recognition that our true defense against these temptations, against these assaults of the devil, is actually our faith in the Lord. It's our deepening relationship with Him. And it's the way that we allow ourselves to become more and more conformed to the mind of Christ by spending these long hours in prayer and in study of the scriptures. Undeniably, the most famous anchoress was a woman named Julian of Norwich. She was born in the late 14th century and spent the better part of her life as an anchoress in Norwich. Julian is also the author of a very famous work called Revelations of Divine Love, which remains to this day one of the classics of Christian mysticism. This book was written as a response to a series of visions she received. Though whether she received these visions before or after her confinement is somewhat in doubt. Nevertheless, these books, which describe the nature of divine love, have been a great source of comfort and an inspiration to devotion for a great many people. And in it, she also writes the following prayer, which is one of my favorites. It's a beautiful expression of just that type of trust and faith in the Lord that allowed the Anchoresses and Anchorites to take on the task of confronting the temptations and the challenges of a life in solitude. And so I'll leave you with it today. God, of your goodness, give me yourself, for you are enough for me. And anything less that I could ask would not do you full honor. And if I ask anything that is less, I shall ever be in want. But in you alone I have everything. Amen.